We're now going to discuss how we make the transition from life being in the water to life moving on to land. And we're specifically going to talk about plants and fungi today. Before we can talk about how plants colonize land, we need to define what a plant is. And so it's going to be a multicellular eukaryote, and it's going to carry out photosynthesis. And it has a set of adaptations that are going to allow them to live on land. Now, photosynthesis is going to be what distinguishes plants from the animal and fungal kingdoms, because both of those are also eukaryotic multicellular organisms, but both of those are going to be heterotrophs and not autotrophs performing photosynthesis like plants. Now, algae are going to be a close relative of plants, but they are going to be in water. And so algae lack the terrestrial adaptations that kind of make plants what they are. There will be some plants that live in the water. However, all of those plants are derived from plants that were initially terrestrial. So they were on the land, they evolved, and then moved back into the water. Now here we have a phylogenetic tree showing the different types of kind of plant-like ancestors that we have. So you can kind of see how we have some groups that are mainly completely in the water, and then when we get to terrestrial plants, they are then on the land, and those are going to make up this group called the land plants. Now, for plants to live on land, they have to have a number of adaptations. And these are going to include kind of being able to hold their bodies upright, because if we look at algae stands upright in water, but it's going to go limp if you take it on land. If you've ever been to the ocean, you know if you see these algae and seaweed, they basically flop on the ground. But plants are going to be able to stand upright against gravity. Plants are also going to be able to deal with water loss, and so they're going to be on land and will not dry out like algae would. Right. Algae also are going to take carbon dioxide in from the water, and so once they're on land, they're unable to take carbon dioxide in the gaseous form from the atmosphere, although plants are going to make that adaptation. So now we're going to go over some of the adaptations of the plant body. Now, the different resources that are necessary for photosynthesis and for other processes for plants, those are going to be found in different locations than would be found in the water, the way that algae would get them. So for example, carbon dioxide will be mainly available in the air. So it's going to be an atmospheric carbon dioxide, it's going to be a gas. Mineral nutrients are going to be found in the soil. So we're going to have those minerals, and we also have water in the soil that the plant is going to need to absorb. So there are going to be complex bodies of the plants that are going to allow them to deal with getting the necessary ingredients for them to perform what they need to perform. So we're going to have these subterranean, which means underground organs, which are going to be called roots. The roots are both going to anchor the plants in the soil, but they're also going to allow them to absorb minerals and water from the soil. And above the ground, we're going to have these organs called shoots. So shoots are going to be kind of these different structures that are going to be stems that are going to be able to transport water and other molecules, but also are going to kind of support the photosynthetic leaves. Now, roots are going to have kind of these large networks that are branching out so that they can receive enough water and minerals. But they also will often have kind of associated fungal relationship, which we call mycorrhizae. Okay, so mycorrhizae are a root fungus symbiosis, so it's good for both the root and for the fungus. And it allows for the roots to actually increase their surface area. So the fungal hyphae, which if you remember from our previous lecture, the hyphae will grow out kind of into these thread-likes, which will then increase the surface area that the plant is able to kind of reach. So the mycorrhizae are an extremely important adaptation for plants to live on land, and it may have been one of the initial kind of important steps that had to happen prior to plants being able to actually establish on land. They had to have this relationship with the fungal. So now if we go up to the shoots and the leaves, leaves are also going to have some adaptations. So leaves are going to be the main photosynthesizing organs of the plant. So they're going to have chloroplasts. They're also going to have stomata, which are those microscopic pores in the bottom layer of the leaf that are going to allow for gas exchange. Both carbon dioxide and oxygen can move through those. The leaves also are going to have a waxy cuticle. You can sometimes take your fingernail and scrape some of the wax off. That cuticle is going to help protect and keep the water inside of the leaf and not have it evaporate. And there also is going to be vascular tissue. So vascular tissue, I want you to think of veins and arteries in our body. So vascular tissue is going to be very similar in plants. Obviously, they're not carrying blood, but they're going to carry these different materials from one place to another. So water needs to be able to come in through the roots and then go up to the shoots and to the leaves. And any of the photosynthetic product that it's made, so glucose, and once it forms into cellulose and starch, those then need to be able to move to other locations in the plant. So the two types of vascular tissue that plants have, one is going to be specialized just for transporting water and minerals from the roots to the leaves, okay? And the other one is going to transport sugars from the leaves to the roots and other non-photosynthetic parts of the plant. So they're kind of doing different things and going different directions often. Now, the name of the two different vascular tissues, the one that carries water and minerals is called xylem, and the one that takes photosynthetic products is called phloem. I won't ask you the two names of those, but just know that there are vascular tissues inside of plants, and they're actually extremely important, and we'll talk about how those will allow for plants to actually be able to move far enough away from water where they don't have to have kind of water right where they are. When we look at the cell walls of the plants in these vascular tissues, they're usually going to be hardened by something called lignin, which is kind of an even tougher material than cellulose. And so the structural strength of the lignin vascular tissue will be also known as wood, and we can use this as a building material. So lignin is extremely tough material. Here's just an image of showing the different types of vascular tissues. Again, you won't need to identify the two different types, but these are very similar to arteries and veins, that they're carrying different materials from one place to another. Now, there also are going to be some reproductive adaptations, because reproduction in water versus land is going to kind of require some different things. So for protist algae, so these are going to be in the water, that means that the sperm are going to be able to swim and get to the egg, and everything's going to stay moist. So nothing dries out because everything is in the water. But if you have a plant that's on land, drying out is going to be a problem, and sperm being able to get to the egg is also going to be a problem if it needs to swim there. Okay, so water is going to be able to provide the means of dispersing the gametes and offspring in algae, but not in plants. So we're going to need to then start to deal with this. So plants have developed many adaptations to deal with this, and one of them is going to be the actual development of the seed. But not all plants are going to have seeds. So plants are going to kind of need to develop different ways to produce their gametes in structures that are going to allow them to develop and not dehydrate. The egg is going to remain within the tissue of the mother plant for most of the different plants that we're going to talk about. And in plants, but not algae, the zygote is going to develop into an embryo while still contained within the female parent. So that's going to then protect the embryo and keep it from dehydrating. So this is going to be different from algae, which would be kind of out in the water. When we try to look for the transition from algae to plants, we can look to algae ancestors of plants that carpeted most of the fringes around lakes and coastal marshes. And they lived there more than 500 million years ago. Now, there is a modern day lineage of green algae called charophytes, and it's thought that they resemble early plant ancestors. So the plants and present day charophytes, which we see pictured here, those are going to have evolved from a common ancestor. And through kind of a very long period of time, about 470 million years, we have the adaptations making life on dry land possible. Okay, and so the oldest known plant fossils are around 470 million years old. There are going to be many evolutionary novelties of these first land plants because they are going to be kind of on a new frontier that has not been invaded by any type of organism like this before. So we're going to see the development of some new things that we've never seen before, and we'll talk about those novelties. So here we see the history of the plant kingdom and the different adaptations that have allowed terrestrial plants to adapt to life on land. And if we look at the fossil record, we can see that there are 4 major periods of plants and different evolutionary steps that led to kind of our modern plants that we see today. Okay, and each stage is going to be marked by the evolution of structures that are going to allow for the plants to move into new areas on the land. So some of these are going to be the origin of vascular tissue, which is going to allow plants to move further away from water. They don't actually have to be sitting in it, they can be farther away. We're going to have the origin of seeds and the origin of flowers, which are going to be another. So here are the highlights of plant evolution. We're going to go through them, and then we're going to talk about the 4 different groups that we will discuss. So about 470 million years ago, we have the first groups of plants that are moving onto the land. These are going to be called non-vascular plants. They're also called birophytes. So you could actually use both of those names, the non-vascular plants or birophytes. They are going to be similar. They are not going to have lignin walls. They do not have roots, and they do not have true leaves. Okay? They're going to be mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, and they're going to have to live very, very close to the water because they require water for reproduction. They're basically in very moist environments. The second major event happened 425 million years ago, and this is when we had the first vascular tissues starting to form. The vascular tissues are going to have lignin, which is going to allow the plants to become taller because they can move water from different places in their bodies. They're going to rise above the water, above the ground, and are going to be much taller than we have for the birophytes. Birophytes are very small. Okay? These are going to be the first vascular plants, and they are going to also be seedless, so we call them the seedless vascular plants. The ferns are going to be the main group that we talk about for the seedless vascular plants. Our next major adaptation is going to be 360 million years ago with the gymnosperms. And the gymnosperms are going to be the first plants that have seeds. And a seed is going to be kind of an embryo packaged along with some food that will allow for the actual embryo to develop. It's also going to have a protective covering, which will allow it to be able to survive when it's not in water. These are going to be extremely widespread and diverse, and the gymnosperms are going to include the conifers, which are kind of cone-bearing trees called pines. Our last major event with plants is going to be 140 million years ago, so these are relatively young compared to some of the plants. And these are going to be the angiosperms. They are going to be the first group with flowers, which are going to be complex reproductive structures. They bear seeds, and they're also going to produce fruit. Okay, and we'll talk about this group. These are the most numerous plants living today, and they number over 250,000 species. So here are the 4 groups that we're going to talk about: the bryophytes, the ferns, the gymnosperms, and the angiosperms. So the first group are the bryophytes, and these are very tiny. All of these pictures are going to be difficult to see because they're zoomed in, but these are little tiny drops of water, and so you can see how tiny these little bryophytes are going to be. So bryophytes are going to also be called mosses, and mosses are going to have 2 main terrestrial adaptations that are going to allow for this move to land. They have a waxy cuticle, which means that they will not lose as much water as something like algae when it's on land, so it's able to prevent dehydration. And they also have retention of the embryo within the female plant's body. Okay, so this is going to stay within part of the plant, which has not been seen before. Mosses need water to reproduce because their sperm have to be able to swim and reach the egg in what we call the female gametangium. Okay, and so that is going to be the structure where the female egg is. The sperm has to swim there, and it's going to require water for that to happen. So water is necessary for bryophyte reproduction. So here is a peat moss bog in Scotland. Peat moss is something that people use for fuel in certain areas, but this is the kind of landscape that we think very early these non-vascular plants would have lived in. So there are 2 distinct forms when we look at the bryophytes. They have a green sponge-like plant, which is going to be kind of down near the bottom. Looks kind of like a little pine tree almost. I circled it. That is going to be called the gametophyte, okay? And it's going to be the dominant part of the plant. The second part is called the sporophyte, and the sporophyte is this long stem-like structure with a little spore capsule on the top. Now, this is kind of confusing about plants, but they have something called alternation of generations. And what this has to do with is the number of copies of chromosomes for the different parts of the plant. Okay, and so we're going to talk about the gametophytes. The gametophytes are going to be haploid, so they're going to have 1 N, so that's the number of chromosomes in that part of the plant. The sporophytes are going to be diploid, and so they're going to be 2 N. Okay, and so I know this sounds very strange, but they have this life cycle that involves both a 2N and a 1N that are actual parts of the plant, you know, actual structures. Unlike humans, where yes, we have gametes, those are sperm and egg, but those are kind of in our testes or ovaries. So the gametophyte produces gametes, so they're going to be 1N, and those unite to form a zygote, which then turns into the sporophyte, which is 2N. Okay, the sporophytes then produce spores, okay, and the spores will then give rise to new gametophytes. Okay, so we have this alternation between a sporophyte and a gametophyte, and they have different numbers of chromosomes depending on what part of the life cycle that you're in. So here we have the gametophyte, and this is going to be the dominant part of the plant, or the biggest part of the plant. It is 1N, so it has 1 copy of each chromosome. It goes through mitosis, and it produces gametes, sperm and egg, that have 1N inside of them. Fertilization then takes place, and we form a zygote that has 2N. And once the zygote forms, that grows into a sporophyte, which is this other structure. The sporophyte will have a spore capsule, which will then have these little spores that are going to turn into gametophytes. The spores are produced by meiosis, which then creates haploid spores. We then go through the process of mitosis, which then creates the gametophyte, and we start all over again. So alternation of generations is this alternation between a gametophyte and a sporophyte. The gametophyte is going to be haploid, the sporophyte is going to be diploid. So gametophytes produce gametes that unite to form zygotes, which develop into new sporophytes. The sporophyte then produces spores that give rise to new gametophytes. Okay, and so we have this transmitting of DNA through these alternation of generations in this haploid-diploid alternation. If you would like to watch this video, it will go over the process of the alternation of generations in the moss life cycle. So now we're going to move on to the seedless vascular plants, which is going to be kind of dominated by the ferns. The major evolutionary adaptation for ferns is that they develop vascular tissue, which allows ferns to move further away from water, meaning they can kind of enter into a variety of habitats that mosses could not enter. The ferns are going to be by far the most numerous of this seedless vascular group, with more than 12,000 different species. However, the sperm of ferns, like mosses, will need water, so the ferns can't be in too dry of environments. So you would not find a fern in a desert, for example. So ferns are going to be found in locations where there's quite a bit of water and rainfall, and if you've ever been to places like the redwoods or up in northern Pacific areas, that is going to be kind of the perfect area for these ferns. The sperm are going to have flagella, which allows them to swim and be able to get to the egg and fertilize it. If we travel back to the time of the Carboniferous period, which is 360 to 300 million years ago, the plant diversity is going to be much different than what we see today. And so we're going to have kind of the dominant group is going to be these seedless vascular plants. And many of these seedless vascular plants are no longer present. They've gone extinct. There would have been lots of ferns there. Ferns are going to be the group that stuck around and are still very common. But this group would have been kind of the diversity of seedless vascular plants that formed a swampy tropical forest that covered most of Eurasia and North America. So now we can look at the alternation of generations in the fern. So one big difference between ferns and mosses is that the sporophyte is going to be the dominant stage. And so when you look at a fern plant, what you're seeing is the sporophyte. So it has diploid cells. What you don't often see is going to be the gametophyte, which is a separate structure that kind of looks like a heart, which we see right here. So that we have the young gametophyte that I just put an arrow next to. So during the alternation of generations, very similar to what we saw in mosses, we're going to go from haploid to diploid. And so let's start with the actual mature sporophyte, because this is the plant that we start with. On the bottom side of the leaves of the fern, you have these little clusters of spores called sori, and those are going to have spores. The spores are going to be haploid, and when the spores kind of are released from the sori, they are going to form the young gametophyte. The young gametophyte has this kind of heart structure, and there's a part of it that is the female part, and there's a part that's the male part. So we have kind of what we call an archegonium, which is the egg, and then we have an antheridium, which is going to have the sperm. The sperm is then going to need to get to the archegonium and actually fertilize the archegonium. Once we have fertilization, we then have a zygote, which is now a diploid because it has from the egg and the sperm DNA. That will then turn into a young sporophyte on the gametophyte. And so we have that heart structure, but now we're having the sporophyte start to develop out of it, and we now have our big plant. So you normally will not see the gametophyte stage for the fern unless you're really paying attention for it. So here is going to be the fern life cycle if you want to watch. Now, The interesting thing about ferns is we actually use them in our everyday lives, but we use them in a form that you would not recognize. So when seedless vascular plants died, they fell into these stagnant wetlands because we said it was kind of a wet, swampy area. They did not decay completely, but they then formed these very thick organic deposits that were gradually converted to coal. So if they had enough sediment on top of them, we then have this conversion to coal. They then turn into fossil fuels. So fossil fuels that we use to power our cars and things are from the fossilized bodies of dead ancient plants and animals. Okay, so fossil fuels are formed from the remains of long dead organisms, and this includes coal, oil, and natural gas. So when we burn the fossil fuels, we release the carbon dioxide that was originally in those bodies of those organisms, which is then kind of increasing the level of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere at a rate much higher than it normally would be, because we are releasing it from very deep down in the earth, and that is going to be one of the major causes of global climate change. We're now going to move on to our next group, the gymnosperms. And so we have a nice pine forest that we're looking at here. The gymnosperms are going to be kind of a major advancement over the ferns. So they're going to be able to grow extremely tall and deal with some more harsh conditions that ferns and mosses would not be able to deal with. Near the end of the Carboniferous period, the climate changed to become drier and colder, and this favored the development of seed plants, which are able to withstand harsher conditions. So they can complete their life cycle on dry land. They do not require water. So both the ferns and the mosses required water for reproduction to take place. So this is going to be a major advancement over the ferns and the mosses. Okay, they're going to also be able to withstand long, harsh winters. So gymnosperms, we don't have it around here, but you often see pictures from other places that have nice pine trees and lots of snow. And so we know that they are going to be able to handle those really harsh conditions. The descendants of early gymnosperms are going to include the conifers, and conifers are going to be cone-bearing plants. So I think most people have seen a pine cone, and so that is what we're talking about. This is going to be part of the reproductive structure of the gymnosperm. And before I move on, the word gymnosperm means naked seed, which these seeds are not going to have kind of a fruit around them. When we get to the angiosperms, we're going to talk about fruit. So these are going to be naked seeds. Conifers are going to be a really great example of gymnosperms, and they're going to cover much of northern Eurasia and North America. They are going to be evergreen, which means that they keep their needles or leaves throughout the entire year, unlike deciduous trees which drop them during the fall. They are going to include both the tallest, largest, and oldest organisms on the planet. And I will tell you about both the tallest and I guess the largest plus the oldest organisms on the earth. They are going to form very productive forests, and they are going to provide lumber for building, wood pulp for paper production. So they're very productive forests and are going to provide us with many things that we need. So here is Methuselah, which is the name of this tree. This is a bristlecone pine, which is found in White Mountains, California, and it is aged to about 4,850 years. So this is the oldest living organism on the planet that we know of. So again, Methuselah, this is in California, and you can hike up to see these type of bristlecone pines. They look dead, but there are parts of them that are still living. This tree here, the one that stands above all the rest, is named Hyperion, and it is the tallest tree in the world. Its exact location is unknown, but it is in California. So California is home to both the oldest and the tallest organisms on the planet. We have two pictures, one where we can see how kind of its branches don't start until way above the other trees, And those are tall trees themselves. And the other is from the bottom of the base of the trunk looking up to the branches. Here is an infographic that shows Hyperion, which is on the very far right. So Hyperion is about 116 meters. It's over 300, I think over 350 feet tall. So it's much taller than Big Ben, which is obviously a very large clock. It is also a lot taller than the Atlantis space shuttle. There are other trees that are pretty tall, but again, Hyperion is going to reign supreme. Now, one of the big adaptations for the gymnosperms is going to be the seed. Okay, so the seed is going to be extremely important for kind of the survival of this group. So the first adaptation is going to be a greater development of a diploid sporophyte compared with the haploid gametophyte generation. So in this case, we are going to have, if we look at Hyperion, that is the sporophyte. It is enormous. The whole tree is a sporophyte. The gametophytes are now going to be located within the cones of the trees. And so they are much smaller than the total size of the sporophytes. So a pine tree or the conifer is the sporophyte, and the gametophytes are going to be on the cones. So the actual parts of the cones. We're going to have both male and female cones in some cases. When I'm going to show you, so the actual female cone is this part. So when we think of a pine cone, we tend to think of that's the female part. And the male part of the cone is going to be these structures right here. And so you've probably sneezed from the actual the male part of the gametophyte because it's pollen. So pollen is going to be the sperm of the tree, and it's very small and is going to be windblown, and it's going to then land on these pine cones, which is the female part. Okay, so if we look at the size differential between both the gametophyte and sporophyte in the different groups. So in our mosses, which is this first group, you're going to have the gametophyte, which is the dominant stage, so it's much larger than the sporophyte. The sporophyte is going to be shown in blue. When we move on to the next group, the ferns, the sporophyte is larger, it's the more dominant stage, and the gametophyte is very small. And we even take that further, where we now have the sporophyte is going to be potentially a whole pine tree, and the gametophyte is going to be very small compared to that. And so it's only within the mosses, the biophytes, that we have the gametophyte as a dominant stage. So make sure you remember that. It's a very important point. It is the only one that has gametophyte as the dominant stage. The second major adaptation for the seed plants is the evolution of pollen. So pollen grain is a very small male gametophyte, and it's going to house the cells that develop into the sperm. So I would just think of pollen grain as being sperm. It has the male DNA that will then be able to fertilize the female egg. Now, in the cases of conifers, the pollen is going to be kind of the way that the pollen is going to deliver the actual sperm to the female, and this is all going to occur via wind. And so at this point of the year, there's lots of pollen everywhere. It often looks kind of like a yellowish dust, and that is going to be the pollen of the pine trees that we have in this area. These are microscopic images of pollen, so they make them look very large, but these are microscopic and are going to be able to float on the wind and up your nose and make you sneeze. So here is a ponderosa pine, and you can see the ovule producing cone, which is going to be what we call the pine cone. The scale, which is the actual location of the egg, we'll see in a second in more detail. And the pollen producing cones are the ones that when you pick them, you can then crush them in your fingers and they can be airborne. So they're much smaller. Most trees are going to have both female and male cones on them. So you'll have both male and female. So the third terrestrial adaptation is the development of the seed. So a seed is going to be a plant embryo, which is a baby plant. And it's also going to be food for the baby embryo and a protective coating. So there's going to be a coating around the seed, so around the embryo, so that it's going to be protected. Okay, the seeds will develop from the ovules. So an ovule is going to be the female reproductive part. So I would think of it as an egg. That is going to have the female DNA in there. So if it is then fertilized by pollen, which is the male, it's then going to develop this embryo. Once we have kind of the male and female fertilization from the parent plant, the seed can remain dormant for days, months, or even years. So you can have kind of certain pine cones won't actually open and release the seeds until they've had a fire come by, and they won't open until the fire has actually burned them. So some of them can last for very long periods of time without kind of dying, and they'll just stay dormant. Now, once there are favorable conditions, the seed can then germinate, which means it's going to start to make kind of its first leaves and sprout, and then you're going to have from that a seedling that's going to grow into the full-on plant. So here we have a section of a female cone kind of cut in half, and if you take one of the scales of the pine cone, so that's what they're called, on there you're going to have the actual egg. Okay, so that's going to be the female ovule, which is going to house the female DNA. We then are going to have sperm, and if the pollen grain comes in and is able to fertilize the ovule, we will then have the development of the actual embryo, which you can see in the bottom. So we have the embryo right here. Okay, so here's up close. We have, this is what we consider the egg. We have the egg nucleus, the spore. So this is going to be what we call the egg. And we then will have pollen come in. It can then fertilize the egg, so it comes up here and can release the DNA, and we can have fertilization take place. We then have the development of the embryo. So this again is the embryo. And then this yellow part is going to be food. So we have food that is going to be able to nourish this very young plant. And the seed coat is going to protect this from dehydration. So here's a video of the pine life cycle. We're now moving on to the angiosperms, and it's hard not to love flowers. Angiosperms are going to be the group that evolved flowers. And so on here we have lots of different beautiful flowers. The one flower I want to talk about is this bee orchid. And so this is a really cool orchid. If you look at it, it kind of looks like a bee. And so what happens is it has this adaptation that this part on right here, this part looks like a female bee to males, and the males will come in and try to mate with this female bee. And there are these two little things that have pollen on them, and when the male tries to mate with this female bee, he gets pollen on him, and this then allows for pollination of the plants. And so it's kind of this trickery that this plant has evolved over time. So angiosperms are going to dominate our modern landscape. So what we see today are mostly going to be angiosperms. Obviously there are other, we can find ferns, we can find mosses, we can find pine trees. But most of the plants that we see, the ones that have flowers, fruit, those are all going to be angiosperms, and they're going to be very numerous. So there are about 250,000 species, and there are only about 700 species of gymnosperms. So you can see that there is a vast difference in the number. Angiosperms are very successful. Okay, they're successful due to a couple different adaptations. They have refined the vascular tissue system, and it makes the kind of transport of water and the different photosynthetic molecules much more efficient than it is in gymnosperms. and they're going to have the evolution of the flower, which is going to be able to increase kind of their ability to pollinate and not leave it up to the wind like the gymnosperms do. So flowers are going to be the site of procreation, and the showiness of them attracts insects and other animals to come into them and help pollinate the flowers. So there's usually this mutual beneficial relationship between pollinators and the plants that they pollinate, because the pollinators need some type of food source and the plants need the pollinators, and so there is this kind of relationship that develops between them. Now there are some angiosperms that rely mainly on the wind, and so what I have here is a picture of orchids, which are obviously showy flowers, and then we have a picture of a grass. Grass also have flowers, so this is an example of a grass flower. It is not quite as colorful or most would find as beautiful, but it is going to be a flower, and these are going to tend to rely on wind pollination. They don't attract insects and other pollinators like the showy flowers. Okay, so many grasses and many trees will have wind pollination in this, and they'll have much smaller, less flamboyant flowers. The reason why they do this is because instead of having these beautiful flowers, they are going to kind of have massive amounts of pollen that is released. And so instead of having a pollinator, they kind of leave it up to chance, but they do that with massive amounts of pollen that can kind of move through and hopefully hit the right plant. So here's some pictures of different pollinators. Insects are not the only pollinators. I have two pictures of insects on here, both a butterfly and a honeybee. Both of the honeybee is completely covered in pollen, but we also are going to have vertebrates that are going to be pollinators like birds. So here is a picture of a hummingbird, and we have this, again, kind of very close relationship between the flower and the bird. And you can see, if you look closely enough, that when the bird comes in, this part of the flower, which I'll explain what that is, that has pollen on it, is going to hit the top of the bird's head, and then the bird is going to transfer the pollen from flower to flower, thus acting as a pollinator. We also are going to have mammal pollinators. So this is a bat that kind of basically gloms onto this huge flower and is going to get the nectar from it and then move on to the next plant, thus pollinating for this plant. Pollinators are extremely important. I found this diagram that I just think is really beautiful, but the pollinators do a massive amount of work that if we did not have them, someone would have to do that by hand. Like a human would have to take a paintbrush and kind of take pollen from one flower to the next. And so it's really important to make sure that we maintain our pollinators and have them have healthy populations, because we would suffer both economically and in other ways if we kill off our pollinators. So let's talk a little bit more about the flower, because the flower is again going to be this part of the plant that is all for reproduction. And we are going to need to know a little bit about the anatomy of a flower. So a flower is going to be just modified stems and leaves. So they are going to have been leaf-like, and in some flowers the leaves are actually green, or the flower petals are green, but through the process of evolution and adaptation and natural selection, we've gotten flowers that are beautiful in all different colors. So the sepals are going to be these outer parts of the flower, and are usually going to be, so if you've ever seen a rose that's closed, they're going to be kind of the first outer layer of the flower, and they're green, and then they eventually will open. Next are going to be the petals. The petals are often going to be very brightly colored and are thought to help attract pollinators. So birds and bees and other insects are going to have different types of vision that we do, and we think that flowers are trying to attract those different pollinators with those colors and patterns. We next have the stamen, and the stamen is going to be the male reproductive part. So we're going to have kind of a long sort of stem-like structure, and then at the tip you're going to have where all of the pollen grains are going to be. If you've ever had a lily or some type of flower like that and you've touched the pollen, the stamen, the pollen will often come off on your fingers and can dye your fingers, and it's very fine. Those are going to be the actual pollen grains. Okay, and they're found on the anther, which is what that part is called. We then are going to have the carpel, and the carpel is going to be the female reproductive structure. It's going to have a couple different parts of it. The ovary is going to be at the base, and that is where the actual egg is going to be contained. Okay, we have the stigma, which is going to be the top location. So the stigma is going to be up here. I guess I should do that in a different color. It's a little bit difficult to see. So here is the stigma. The stigma is often sticky and will trap pollen. And then we have kind of the style, which is going to be the filament that the stigma is attached to. So this is the basic structure of a flower, but there's lots of variation in different flowers. And sometimes it's pretty difficult to figure out what part is what. So if I ask you about any of the anatomy of a flower, it'll be on this flower specifically. So here are some different flowers. We have a prickly pear cactus, pansy, bleeding hearts, the California poppy, water lily, and a snapdragon. And so they all have very different shapes and structures, but they're all going to be the reproductive parts and have the male and female pollen and ovary. And here is a beautiful picture from last super bloom of California poppies out in Lake Elsinore. So flowers are going to be absolutely essential for the angiosperm life cycle. And when we have the angiosperm, the sporophyte generation is going to be dominant, just like we have in both the ferns and the gymnosperms. And the gametophyte is going to be contained within the body of the plant. So here is kind of an overview of the life cycle of an angiosperm. And so we're going to go through this step by step. So for the first step, we have the flower is going to be the sporophyte, part of the plant. And like the gymnosperms, the pollen grain is going to be the male gametophyte. Okay, and so we're going to have pollen on those anthers for the male part. And the female gametophyte is going to be located in the ovule. So that is where the ovary is going to be contained within the flower. If pollen grains attach to the stigma, they will actually grow this long pollen tube that will go down through the carpel and go into the ovary, and the sperm will actually transmit its nuclei into the egg, and we will then have fertilization. Once fertilization takes place, we have then a zygote, and it's going to have endosperm, which is going to be the nutritious part of the seed that's going to allow for the seed to survive. Okay, the zygote will then develop into an embryo. Again, it's going to have this nutrient-rich endosperm, which is going to provide food for the growing plants. Okay, once the whole ovule develops into the seed, it can germinate, which then means it's going to start to grow a new plant, and we are going to start the process all over again. Now, one thing we're going to notice is that there is a special structure that can happen, which is the production of fruit. So fruit is going to be developing from the ovary. So when you eat fruit, you are eating the female reproductive part of a plant. I hope that doesn't gross you out. It shouldn't. But the fruit is actually going to be another way to attract kind of different organisms in order to have fruit, in this case, seed dispersal. So it's not pollen dispersal. They're not pollinators, but they're actually going to start to disperse the plant. So fruit is going to be a ripened ovary. It helps protect the seed, and it also increases seed dispersal. It mainly does that because it attracts organisms that are then going to eat the fruit. They're then going to digest all of that and poop out the seeds in different locations, and also with a little bit of fertilizer. the fruit are going to be a major source of food for all different types of animals, including us. And so here's just a variety of different fruits that have their seeds inside. So if you ever have this conversation of what's a fruit versus a vegetable, anything that has seeds is a fruit. So if anything that is part of the reproductive part of the plant is a fruit, anything that's the vegetative part, so that means like the leaves or the roots, or like potatoes are a tuber, which is part of the root structure for storage of starch, those are all going to be vegetables. But anything that has fruit and is a part of the reproductive structure is considered fruit. So here we can see kind of how these different types of fruit develop and what the flowers look like. And so there's lots of variation. We can call a pea fruit is a simple fruit. We have things called aggregated fruit, and then even multi-fruit, which is something like a pineapple. So a pineapple has lots of seeds inside of it. If you've ever opened a pineapple and seen those little black things that are near the outside skin, those are actually the seeds. And there are also going to be types of fruit that aren't necessarily what you would eat, but they're going to be wind dispersal types, and then also some that are transported by animals, but not in a way that the animal is going to like. Often they're going to be thorns or these prickly things that get stuck in your socks or on your fur. Now, angiosperms are extremely important with agriculture. So like I said before, angiosperms are going to be necessary for we eat. They're a major source of our food. The gymnosperms are going to be a major source of our lumber and paper, but all of our nearly all of our food, our supply of fiber like cotton and things like that, many medications, perfume, and decoration are all going to be examples of angiosperms. Okay, and so agriculture developed kind of due to people trying to kind of cultivate plants and have a dependable food source. Okay, and so lots of plants have been domesticated because we have then picked the ones that we like the best. They taste the best, the sweetest, they're the biggest, those types of things. And so we have kind of used artificial selection to produce the diversity of plants we have today. So we have made, enormous varieties of apples and oranges and all different citrus and things like that through the process of kind of selection, human selection. Now we tend to think of plants as being renewable resources because we can plant a plant and then harvest our crop, and then it grows back the next year and we can harvest it again. But plant diversity itself is a non-renewable resource. Once we wipe out forests, we can never get those back. And there can be some species that are really rare that we don't even know about that we're destroying. And so it's a very big problem and a critical ecosystem that we are destroying at a very fast rate. Now, the forest ecosystems are going to be home to more than 80% of the world's terrestrial plants and animal species. And so we're losing both plants and animals. Now, why do these tropical forests matter? Well, they are going to be the home for millions of people, and they're going to depend on those forest ecosystems for their livelihood. Okay, and more than 120 prescription drugs are made from substances derived from plants. And so when we destroy whole swaths of rainforest, we are potentially destroying plants that could be sources of, cancer drugs or other types of drugs that are going to help cure some really horrible diseases. And so we won't even know about that if we get rid of these resources before we do that. It is a very complex issue because many of the people that are destroying the forests are then becoming our farmers and are doing it because it's their livelihood. And so I have a picture of these orangutans. They are losing their habitat to palm oil farms, but the people that are running these palm oil farms are often going to be people that need it. They have no other source of income. So it is a very complex issue, but something that does need to be addressed. And so scientists are working on kind of a way to slow plant diversity by helping to research how to do kind of farming in a sustainable way that will help kind of both people and the forest together. So we know that people and humans are going to need to cut down parts of rainforest, but if there's ways to do it in a way that's not going to destroy habitat completely and damage all of the resources, then we need to start doing it that way. So it's really important to appreciate rainforests and kind of the ecosystems that they are, because they potentially hold the key to maybe future prescription drugs that will help solve many issues. So here are some examples of the different products that are derived from plants. So we talked about food and building materials before, and the medicines. And so here are a couple examples of the medicines. We have atropine, which is from the belladonna plant. And if you've ever been to the eye doctor and they've done a pupil dilator, that is what they derive that from. We have digitalin, which is from the flower foxglove, and that's a heart medication. We have quinine, which is from a quinine tree, which is important in malaria prevention. And Taxol, which is from Pacific yew, that is actually an ovarian cancer drug. And so lots of different types of products from these different plants are used as medications. So we're now done with going over the different plants, but I wanted to review kind of the highlights of plant evolution. So remember that biophytes are going to be the oldest group of plants that we have. They are non-vascular, they do not have lignified walls, they do not have true roots, and they do not have true leaves. The groups that are going to be found in this are going to be the mosses, the liverworts, and the hornworts. And so you can Google those. I showed mostly mosses and liverworts, but if you want to see what hornworts and liverworts look like in more detail, they're just very tiny little plants. The next group were the vascular plants, and these are going to have conductive tissues that are hardened with lignin. They are not going to have seeds, so they're often called vascular seedless plants or seedless vascular plants, and the fern is going to be the best example of this group. We then have the gymnosperms. They are going to be the first plant that develops seeds. A seed is going to consist of an embryo packed with a store of food, which is called the endosperm. And they are going to have a protective covering over them to help keep them kind of safe. And conifers or pine trees are going to be a good example of the gymnosperms. Our last group and the youngest are the angiosperms. They evolved complex reproductive structures called flowers. They bear seeds within protective chambers called ovaries, and they also produce fruit. And they are by far the most numerous type of plant on the planet at this time. We are now moving on to our next kingdom, which is kingdom fungi. And we have kind of really cool looking organisms here. They look like plants, but they're actually not related to plants at all. And we're going to get to talk about their diversity and kind of what they do in the environment. So fungi are going to be eukaryotes, so they're multicellular, and they are going to have kind of body structures and modes of reproduction unlike any other organism that we talk about. So we will talk about kind of what's unique to these different fungi. Now, a mushroom, which is, I think, what most people think of when they think of a fungi, it looks very closely related to plants. We actually sell them in our produce part of our grocery store, but they are not related to plants at all. They're actually more related to you than they are to a plant. And so if you look at the DNA, it shows that fungi are much more closely related to animals. We did evolve or separate about 1 billion years ago, but still that's closer than when we separated from the plants. Fungi are going to be extremely important in the environment because they're going to help recycle vital chemicals back to the environment in forms that other organisms can use. And so they're going to be decomposers, which is going to allow for dead material to get incorporated back into the environment. Fungi are extremely important for the success of many plants because of the mycorrhizae that we've talked about before, which is this fungus root association that help plants kind of absorb more mineral and water from the soil. Now, fungi are going to come in lots of different shapes and sizes, and there are more than 100,000 species. So here we can just see a few of them. but we are going to go over some of the different groups of fungi. So fungi are going to be heterotrophs who are going to absorb their nutrients. So what they do is they are going to digest the food outside of their body, and they do this by secreting enzymes. So if you think about us, we have these digestive enzymes inside of our stomach. What fungi do is they actually would then kind of secrete their digestive enzymes on the food that they're sitting on, and then once it's broken down into simpler compounds, they will then absorb it and then use it for themselves. Now, for the actual structure of a fungus, it's going to depend on what type we're talking about, but most of them are going to be made out of these thread-like filaments called hyphae. Okay, and so the fungal hyphae are these threads of cytoplasm surrounded by a plasma membrane and a cell wall. But the cell wall is not like that what we find in plants, but it's actually made out of chitin, which is the same polysaccharide that's found in insect skeletons. So again, they're more closely related to us than they are to plants. The hyphae will then branch into these different kind of regions, an interwoven network called a mycelium, and that is the feeding structure of the fungus. And so the mycelium and hyphae will actually grow into the food and the substrate that they're sitting on, and then they'll secrete their enzymes and then absorb the food back into their bodies. Now when we look at fungal reproduction, we are going to mainly talk about the mushroom, because the mushroom is going to be the reproductive part of the mushroom or of the fungus. So the mycelium is mainly underground, and then when reproduction is necessary, a mushroom will arise from the ground, okay, and it pops up from the ground, and it's going to be up there because it is needed for spore dispersal. So spores, which are going to be kind of the reproductive part, are then going to be taken on air currents. Right? So most fungal species are going to release haploid spores that they can produce either sexually or asexually, and they will then kind of spew the clouds of spores into the air and allow for them to travel. Okay, there are these things called puffballs, which are reproductive structures that, again, have these spores inside and basically explode, and the spores go everywhere. Fungi, along with bacteria, are going to be the key decomposers of most ecosystems. And what they do is they'll actually take kind of dead, dying material of other organic organisms, break them down into the elemental form like carbon, nitrogen, and other elements, and will then allow those to be ready for use for other organisms. So plants need a ready source of these inorganic nutrients. Decomposers like fungi and bacteria will make those available to them. Otherwise, they would stay locked in the dead bodies of the different organisms. Fungi are going to be really well adapted for decomposing of organic refuse. They have these invasive hyphae that will then grow into the tissues of the dead materials and will then digest all the polymers, including cellulose, which is a very tough material to decompose of the plant cell walls. And so then those nutrients are going to be available for other living things. Now, not all fungi are going to be decomposers. Some of them are going to be parasitic. And a parasitism is going to be a relationship when you have two different species that are in contact with each other. One of the organisms is going to benefit from the interaction and the other one is going to be harmed. And in these parasitic interactions, the fungus is going to do well and the host is going to be harmed. So parasitic fungi will actually absorb the nutrients from the cells or the body fluids of the living hosts. There are more than 100,000 known species of fungi, and about 30% of those are going to be living as parasites. Okay, and about 500 species of the fungi are known to be parasitic in humans and other animals, and they can cause things like yeast infections, ringworm, and athlete's foot. And unfortunately, the cats, when I adopted them, the ones I just got, they had ringworm when I got them, which is a fungal infection. It's not deadly or anything, but they did give it to me, so I've been in quarantine for that. And also things like athlete's foot. Now, these insects are all, unfortunately, victims of parasitic fungus infections. And these fungal infections are deadly for the insects. The parasites actually kind of overtake the body and make the insects do very strange things. And then it's kind of gross, but you then have out of the exoskeleton different parts of the fungal bodies growing out and releasing spores. So most of the majority of the fungal parasites are going to infect plants. Now here are two examples of parasitic fungi that are going to infect plants. We have the Dutch elm disease. It actually kind of creates this very beautiful pattern on the tree, but it is deadly. And then our second is deadly ergot, which is going to infest grains like wheat. Now, it might seem strange for us to now start talking about the Salem witch hunt, but there is a possible connection between deadly ergot that I just talked about, which is a fungus of kind of a wheat or a grain, and the Salem witch hunt. So in 1692, 8 young girls were accused of being witches, and all of them had symptoms which were consistent with ergot poisoning. And when you're poisoned with ergot, there is lots of different symptoms, and some of them include things like hallucinations and body convulsions and vomiting and things like that. And the question is it possible that ergot outbreak actually caused these young girls to have these symptoms and they weren't actually witches, but were just being poisoned and having these kind of weird symptoms? The hypothesis is that the girl symptoms were the results of ergot poisoning. And the prediction is that if we look at the historical facts of the kind of what was going on in that period of time, specifically with agriculture, we may be able to see if this is consistent with our hypothesis. Now, when they actually looked at agricultural records of 1691, they found that that was a particularly warm and wet year, which is when ergot thrives. Okay, and so when the symptoms started to appear, that was after a period of time when ergot possibly could have been in the grain source, and so what people were eating. The records from the following year, when the accusations of witchcraft then died down, was a dry-off year, and there was an ergot die-off, and so you wouldn't have more people being accused of witches because there isn't any ergot anymore. Now, this is a correlation, and it does show that there's some consistent evidence with the hypothesis, but this isn't conclusive because there are also a lot of other reasons why witch hunts take place. Some of them have to do with misogyny, others have to do with kind of creating scapegoats for disasters and lots of different types of reasons. But it is possible that ergot poisoning led to these symptoms that then had people confused, and instead of going to, because they didn't understand science in many ways, or ergot poisoning, they went straight to, they must be witches. There are many fungi that actually have commercial uses. So most of us have eaten mushrooms, and there are lots of people that are enthusiasts that like to go around hunting for different fungi that you can find in fields and forests. Although it's important to know what you're doing because there are many poisonous species that are very similar in appearance to edible fungi. Fungi are also going to be commercially important. They make antibiotics. So in this agar plate, we have penicillium, which is a fungus, and it is going to be causing kind of a zone of inhibition next to staphylococcus, which is a bacterium. And this is caused because penicillium makes something called penicillin, which is an antibiotic. Other fungi are going to be used for decomposing our waste, and we also use fungi for making bread, wine, beer, and cheeses. Mushrooms have also been used for their psychedelic effects for thousands of years. So we have here on the right side of the screen various mushroom stones that can trace back all the way to 1000 BC. They were most likely used in religious rituals about 6,000 years ago, and we know that native peoples of Mesoamerica used them for religious communion, divination, and healing. It's thought that the Aztecs and Maztecas referred to psilocybin, which is the mushroom that causes these psychedelic effects. They would call them divinatory mushrooms and wondrous mushrooms or genius mushrooms. So the effects of psilocybin mushrooms come from the psilocybin and psilocybin, which are going to cause psychedelic effects. There has been new research these days that has actually looked at the medicinal benefits of psychedelic mushrooms. And researchers at Johns Hopkins University have suggested that psilocybin, which is found in the hallucinogenic mushrooms, should be reclassified from a Schedule I drug, which is a drug that has no known medical benefit, to a Schedule IV drug, which is akin to a prescription sleeping pill. And so there are new studies kind of going into how these psychedelic mushrooms can actually be used in a medical way to help treat different types of ailments. Now, I wanted to mention, and I said this before, that mushrooms can be extremely toxic. So it's really important for you not to ever eat a mushroom that you're unsure of its origin or what kind it is. These are just a couple different groups of the most deadly types of mushrooms. They have interesting names like death cap, destroying angels, deadly dapperling, and autumn skullcap. And these often look very similar to edible mushrooms, but if you consume these, some of them will cause organ failure, and they often will destroy your liver. They go in there and your liver will try to detoxify the toxins, and ultimately it causes liver failure and you can die. So it's extremely important not to eat anything that you don't know where it's coming from. And so here's just a lesson learned from The Office to make sure to not eat mushrooms that you find in the forest. Make sure you know what you're eating, or hopefully have a friend that knows what you're eating.